Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities program. Today, you are attending the Brownfield 101 webinar, so welcome. We have some great information to share with you for communities looking to redevelop brownfield properties in North Carolina. Before we begin, I just want to go over some general housekeeping. For ease of listen, or to enhance your listenability, we've muted the panelists and you guys during this presentation. And for the panelists, when it is your turn to talk, you can just unmute yourself, but we just ask that you mute yourself when you're not talking to limit the feedback. Secondly, we have a Q&A box in the bottom right-hand corner, and you can make sure that all attendees is checked, or all panelists is checked, and input your question, and we'll try to get to your questions at the end of the presentation. And then lastly, everybody usually wants to know this, but the presentation slides will be made available after the webinar. You will receive an email from Eventbrite around 12:30 or so with a link to all the materials from all the speakers that you're going to hear from today, along with the presentation and a recording of the webinar. Next slide, please. So on the agenda for today, we have Jesse Day from PTRC, Piedmont Triad Regional Brownfield Program, and he's going to just introduce us and introduce, why we're here and kind of welcome us. Then you're going to have me talk about the Brownfield overview, steps for assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment, just going over the Brownfield redevelopment process. We're going to have Cindy Nolan from EPA Region 4 talk about the EPA Brownfields program and their funding. Then we're going to have Jordan Thompson and Haley Irick talk about the North Carolina DEQ's Brownfield program. David Putnam is going to speak about opportunity zones, and Brad Bishop from Groundworks USA is going to give us an open space Brownfield success story. And then Jesse will close us out, and we'll try to answer any questions that you guys have submitted during the presentation. So with that said, I will hand it off to Jesse. Next slide. And he will give you an overview of Piedmont Triad's Regional Council's Brownfield program.
Well, good morning, everyone. On today's webinar, I think we've got a great breadth of content for you. I think a lot of the focus from kind of case examples today will be conversion of former brownfields, like you see in the picture here, to more open space properties. But just remember, there's lots of different potential uses for brownfields, from open spaces to housing to commercial and industrial redevelopment. I think there's a lot of opportunity. And next slide, please. The Piedmont Triad is located there in kind of the heart of North Carolina. Our Piedmont Triad Regional Council is a membership agency, a voluntary association of local governments. Cover about 12 counties. We have 74 total members, including all the municipalities involved. And the population is about 1.7 million people, but a kind of a wide range of rural to urban, mid-sized urban cities, Greensboro being the largest, Winston-Salem, High Point, Burlington, the next three. We've been lucky enough to receive EPA funding over the last decade or so for a lot of assessment type work. We've been trying to develop a cleanup fund to address cleanup as well on a regional basis, and hope to continue to do that in the future. But we're currently in the midst of a $600,000 assessment grant to assess phase 1, phase 2 cleanup planning activities in our region. And we've got about a year left of funding. You can see our program goals and objectives imaged on the lower right is from a previous grant, a furniture factory in Thomasville that was converted to low-income housing. So we've been operating for over a decade, our Brownfields program, and it really has helped out a lot of our mill towns and cities address some of the more difficult sites to develop. Next slide, please. So in terms of our specific accomplishments, we have about 31 phase ones, 10 phase twos. You know, the interesting thing about brownfields is that there's lots of you know, potential goals that can be achieved through redeveloping and addressing brownfields. So, you know, there's all those benefits listed there are so impactful, but none of those can happen if you've got an eyesore on the gateway to your city. I'm going to show you one in just a second that has been mothballed for quite a while, and it'll be a good kind of tee up to the keynote there from Groundworks later on in the presentation. And that map is just an example of one of our online maps overlaying NCDEQ sites over our opportunity zones. And David will talk a bit about opportunity zones and how the Brownfields program can interface with the opportunity zone program for our double benefit. Next slide, please. On our current grant, we lucky enough to partner with some of our member governments, Winston-Salem, Thomasville, and Mayodan, to address some catalyst sites. So we're in the midst of addressing those. We've also been able to expand our funding out to do assessment work in the following towns: Liberty, Mount Airy, Elkin, Lexington, Eden, and High Point. And you know, I think other speakers today will talk a little bit about marketing, but really there's, you know, a mix of good old, you know, outreach, direct outreach, as well as attending other real estate and other community organizational meetings are a great way to kind of identify brownfields, because it's a difficult, you know, it's not understood by the general public in terms of what are the issues around getting past you know, older industrial site to getting that going, because the cost of development of those are significant. So it takes some groundwork for sure. And we've been lucky enough to partner with many of our member governments who have helped us identify potential sites. Next slide, please. And so this is one of the conversions that we're looking at in addressing with our current site. You'll see on the map, it may be difficult to see through the WebEx, but near the Virginia border of our region is a small town of Mayodan. They're about 2,700 in population at the intersection of the Mayo and the Dan River there. And so that former textile mill is over 100 acres, and a developer came in and tore it down and left a pile of rubble, and then said, "Well, I'm bankrupt. I've taken everything of value, and I'm sorry, but you can have this property." And so the town took it over, and now can we go forward to the next slides, please? Next slide, please. And so what the town has done is used a technical assistance grant. We've used our current EPA assessment grant to do a phase 2, but the technical assistance grant, which is an interesting program that the state applied for through NCDEQ, applied to EPA to help with some of the area planning. And so what you see from that is a product of that brownfield site. You'll see, if you're looking north to south, some different park features that are planned there. And so phase 2 is just finishing up, and then going to address some of the cleanup activities around some of the asbestos and other debris that's left on the site, but look at turning this into a valuable use. You know, you've got a great asset there, the river, the Mayo River, near a relatively new state park, the Mayo River State Park. And so this is a key asset that the town needs, this small town needs help and support in getting into a more productive use. And in this case, some support of outdoor recreation, as well as some other ancillary activities there as well. So unfortunately, in this case, you know, a lot of the building was sort of destroyed, so they're almost forced in the hand of doing some sort of park development. In addition, not to get too down in the weeds, a good portion of the site is in the floodplain. So, you know, building development there would be a challenge just from that standpoint anyway. So park use makes a lot of sense. So now the town's trying to raise money to develop, to do the cleanup, as well as implement some of the facilities here. But obviously, it's a challenging environment that we're in from a resource standpoint. And so we'll be looking to, under every rock, to figure out what sort of resources we can bring to bear to help develop this park concept for the town of Maida and the greater Western Rockingham County, where this location is. So with that, just a couple of takeaways. If we go to the next slide, in terms of if you're thinking you've got a new assessment grant, or you're thinking about applying for an assessment or cleanup grant, it's just a reminder that there are resources out there to fund redevelopment efforts, but you've got to be creative. One thing to mention too, on this particular site, that the state Brownfield program can bring resources to the table. Great examples, that technical assistance grant was able to cover some of the master planning costs and the future visioning for the site. But Jordan and Haley will get into it in a little bit, but addressing some of the legal side of Brownfield development. And so, just there's lots of pieces that this can support, and I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions during the question and answer period later on, but I want to be respectful of time since we have quite a few speakers to squeeze into the hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Next slide, Sean. So the $1 million question for today is, what is a brownfield? If you are new to brownfields, this may be kind of elusive to you. So I kind of just want to take some time to go over the basics of brownfield redevelopment. In my presentation, I'll be answering questions such as, what is a brownfield? How do I redevelop a brownfield? And how do I get help to do this work? And for those who are just joining, again, my name is Gary White, and I'm with NJIT TAB. We are a technical assistance provider to communities that are looking to redevelop brownfield properties in Region 4. So at the end of the presentation, I'll have my contact information as well. So what is a brownfield? The federal definition of a brownfield is a property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. It's really hard to remember that on a good day. I like to say that a brownfield project is really just a commercial real estate deal with an environmental twist. If you want a more simple and straightforward definition, then it's easy to say that brownfield properties have a clarity and contamination issue. It isn't clear whether or not the site is dirty or clean, or safe for reuse, nor how much that cleanup would cost to redevelop. And that lack of clarity prevents redevelopment. Brownfield properties, in essence, really are no different from any other property. The key to redeveloping a brownfield is navigating and mitigating the risks, the environmental risks that comes with that property. Brownfield developers are tasked with eliminating the threat of further environmental contamination to the public and peeling back that layer of uncertainty that exists on the site in question. Next slide, please. So what do brownfields look like? If you close your eyes, most people envision blighted properties in urban neighborhoods with graffiti and drug paraphernalia littered on the ground. Next slide. However, brownfields are much more diverse than that. They oftentimes include industries that have suffered due to economic collapse, change in industry, change in consumer demands, change in culture. As we're seeing with the COVID-19 crisis, unfortunately, there will be more generation of brownfield within our communities, and it's up to us to really rethink and begin to repurpose them and make communities whole again. Brownfields are, next slide, please. Brownfields are not only located in urban areas. Another way that brownfields can manifest in communities is from farming industries. Land may look clean, but certain pesticides can have a detrimental effect on the soils in which they were used. Next slide. And lastly, brownfields aren't always huge facilities or huge businesses or huge commercial properties with environmental issues. They also include industries that can be found in your neighborhoods. Think of an abandoned gas station or closed dry cleaners or even closed schools. These all can be brownfield properties. So it's safe to say that, next slide, that brownfields cover a wide array of property types with a multitude of past uses, and they're in all of our communities. So while it's important to know what a brownfield is, for the sake of this conversation today, it's important to talk about what a brownfield property is not, or what we are excluding from brownfields. If you're in the industry long enough, you'll find that the public may struggle with identifying brownfields initially. For the purpose of this webinar and our discussion moving forward, brownfields will not include private residential homes. The scope of this webinar and brownfield redevelopment in general is focused on vacant and underutilized commercial and industrial properties um, in Region 4's area. Next slide. So again, in addition, I like to think that brownfields lie in between two different designations, and I'm going to introduce two definitions to you. A green field, which is clean land that has never been developed on, and a Superfund site. In short, it would be an extremely dirty site with industries that have contaminated the property so much that it is an immediate threat to the community around it. Brownfields lie in between. They're sandwiched in between those, where they're not completely clean lands and you're not extremely contaminated lands. Brownfields and Superfund sites differ in a multitude of ways, but it's simplest to think about their distinction by looking at the degree of contamination. Um, Brownfields with Superfund sites, they pose a real threat to human health and or the environment. On the other hand, brownfields, they don't necessarily pose serious or imminent health or environmental threats. Instead, they represent an economic or social threat since they prevent redevelopment and therefore stifle the local economies. Next slide. So how many do we have? EPA has some conservative estimates that state that there's over 500,000 brownfield sites nationally. However, that number again is conservative and ever growing. As industries close and open, there will be a constant ebb and flow of abandoned and underutilized properties that qualify as a brownfield. This number may seem daunting, but can also serve as a reminder that many communities in North Carolina have a lot to clean up and repurpose, and there's a lot of potential that is associated with the redevelopment of these sites. Next slide. So why would I want to do brownfield redevelopment, or why would you want to partake in it? So brownfield redevelopment provides a lot of benefits to the communities that they occur in. But one of the things about brownfield reclamation that I love so much is that they are benefits that you and everybody in your community can see, in that they have a social impact, an economic impact, and of course, an environmental impact to the community. Next slide. Socially, brownfields help to remove health and safety hazards, create open spaces, create spaces for people to interact, and reduce crime. The broken window theory, summarized, is if an environment looks better, then people will do better. Socially, brownfields can also reinvigorate the community and perpetuate this feeling of pride within your towns. Removing health and safety hazards and areas of vacancy and turning them into the most vibrant area of your neighborhood really gives the community a sense of victory and further enjoyment of the community that they live in. Next slide. Economic benefits. These are kind of, the impetus for municipalities redeveloping brownfield sites. Obviously, returning vacant land to the tax rolls helps local government. Brownfield properties also trigger a domino effect in which their redevelopment often catalyzes business activity and other redevelopment within the area. And it's also an opportunity for the community to hire locally and attract businesses looking to expand or relocate. Just some numbers to leave you guys with. Brownfields are also an opportunity to be creative and leverage federal funds, right? The name of the game for brownfield redevelopment is leveraging. Reports across the nation show that for every $1 that the EPA spends on brownfield, brownfield redevelopment, approximately $17 is leveraged in response to that. So if you're innovative and collaborative enough, you can maximize the amount of funding trickling into your community. Next slide. And then last but not least, the bedrock of the brownfield program is, the environment, cleaning up the environment. Brownfield redevelopment produces 32 to 57% less air pollutant emissions per capita relative to conventional developments. And then in terms of stormwater runoff, brownfield properties or brownfield redevelopment projects average 43 to 60% less than a stormwater runoff than an conventional development. The elimination of exposure pathways is also a key to keeping the community healthy and safe. And healthy communities are safe communities. Next slide. So you heard about the benefits. So how do we do this? I would be misleading you if I told you that this process is easy and straightforward. But in an effort to summarize how brownfield projects get done, we prepared a brownfield kind of blueprint or step-by-step process describing how successful projects get from A to B. Next slide. So the first step in this process is planning, right? The first step in the planning process is the creation of a Brownfields task force. The Brownfields task force is a multidisciplinary group of people with a vested interest in the cleanup and redevelopment of a community's brownfield site. Its members bring multiple perspectives and resources to the table. And this task force should include municipal officials from several different departments, such as planning, health, public safety, engineering, and representatives from environmental and economic development organizations, as well as nonprofits and community organizations. Diversity in your task force is extremely important because the range of perspectives will give you better insight for future planning activities. Once you have a brownfields team, the next step should include assessing where you're at. In many cases, people get bogged down and have a tendency to become site centric. They become so focused on the assessment, cleanup, and redevelopment of one target site that they fail to look at the larger picture. Planning is the bedrock of any successful brownfield project. It determines funding, it determines your steps in order of beginning to end, and oftentimes communities are unsure where to start. One of the first tasks that they can often take is to compile an inventory of all the brownfield sites within a given location to get a feel for the magnitude of the problem and also know the variety of sites that exist within their borders. Engaging the community during the planning process for redevelopment of a brownfield site is the single most critical element of a successful brownfield project. Educating the community on brownfields, garnering their input as to the community needs and how those needs can be met through redevelopment, and soliciting their input should all be a part of the community engagement process. Answering questions such as who is the community? Why are you engaging the community? How will you engage the community? When will you engage the community? All these are important questions when going through the community engagement process. And then also figure out what will you do with the results of the engagement? How will you incorporate the feedback into the planning and redevelopment of your site? Feedback to the community and follow through are critical for successful community engagement. Some examples of community engagement would include conducting an assets and needs study to effectively gauge the community's view of the assets that exist and any needs that are unfulfilled, such as food deserts, lack of open space. This open forum and collection of community input is a free market study that will gauge the residents' attitude and also will allow for redevelopment to be effective and meaningful and not duplicative. Once your plan has been compiled with meaningful input from the community, you have an opportunity to research which state, local, and federal funding sources would be able to be used at your project. Next slide. The second step, environmental investigation. So this is essentially the fundamental difference between a brownfield project and any other project. So environmental investigation, why do we do this? You need to conduct your due diligence or your all appropriate inquiry, AAI, prior to buying the site so that you can address the contamination or potential contamination in the most efficient manner so that you can qualify for liability protections and that you can also qualify for federal funding. So this is really a high level look at how environmental investigations work. There are plenty of nuances that exist, but we just want to keep this conversation kind of high level so that everybody can gain from it. The first step, which federally is known as a phase one, effectively answers the question, what environmental issues could we have on site based on prior use? To conduct the phase one, you do not need to own the property, but you do need to have permission from the property owner to access the site. This is especially true for an EPA Brownfield assessment grant. In addition, you do not need to own the site again. During this phase one step, uh, you have a qualified environmental professional who is looking for recognized environmental conditions or indicators of environmental pollution or discharge on the site. No sampling is done, however, there is a site visit and an extensive search of all permits and waste manifests and other information available in government databases are searched through to kind of shed a light on the past uses of the project. At the end of this step, you'll receive a report outlining the details and findings of the assessment of the site and recommendation on whether to proceed forward. The second step is a phase two. And in this step, you are effectively answering the question, do we have contamination or environmental issues on site? Um, During this step, sampling will occur um, and um, sampling will occur to assess whether or not there is a presence of contaminants on site and the samples will be analyzed to see if there's any contamination. If any exceedances are recorded, then process will move forward to the next step. Lastly, the third step, which is federally known as a phase three, effectively answers the question, what is the extent of the contamination of the site? More detailed sampling occurs during this step and will occur at the site and it will fully delineate and depict the contamination at the site. At the end of this step, you should receive a report outlining all the contaminants and their whereabouts on the site. At this point, a huge portion of the risk is identified and increases the chances for mitigation. At the end of this process, you should receive some sort of remedial action work plan that fully explains the site's contamination, the extent, and possible remediation solution. So from phase one to phase three, moving from step one to step three, peels back that layer of uncertainty that prevents redevelopment at the site. The further you move along in this process, the more risk is identified and increases its chance for mitigation. This is the most prudent path to ownership. If you want to leave this conversation on environmental investigation with one thing, always do your due diligence before purchasing a site. Never after. Next slide. Environmental remediation. Um, for this step, this is where we're talking about the cleanup. To clean up the site, you need to own the site. Once the assessments are complete, a remedial action work plan will outline different methods of site remediation options that exist and the costs associated with them. A contracted environmental professional will ensure that the work is done in accordance with state rules and regulations and cleaned up so that redevelopment can start. Next slide, please. And then redevelopment. Again, once the site is safe for intended reuse, two options exist. You can either redevelop the property as a public entity or sell the property to a developer. Whatever option is chosen, it's important for the new owner of the property to be a good steward and ensure that all continuing obligations and deed restrictions are honored. Some examples of a continuing obligation would be if you had to install an environmental cap, you can't compromise the cap in any way. So honor your permits and honor any sort of restrictions or site control measures that are on the site. Next slide, please. So we talked about going from planning all the way into redevelopment. So this is just a gentle reminder that we are here with NJIT TAB as a technical assistance program created by the EPA to help communities redevelop and repurpose their brownfield properties. We provide free assistance to state, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits. And we are here to assist you anywhere along the process. Next slide, please. If you need help, we provide our assistance in 3 ways. One, our resource center, educational forums, and one-on-one technical assistance. Next slide. Our resource center is basically housed on our website, and a link will be sent to you guys after this webinar, but it holds a host of information just pertaining to funding, special niche brownfield topics, how-to videos, you name it, it's probably on our website. And if it's not, let us know. But our website is a really good one-stop shop for communities looking to increase their knowledge on brownfield topics. Next slide. We also provide assistance through educational forums such as this: webinars, conferences, workshops, seminars, boot camps, bringing in experts to talk about extensive topics so that communities can increase their knowledge and also find ways forward, find ways to navigate the hurdles in their brownfield redevelopment process. Next slide. We like to say that our help and technical assistance is very, very useful for communities. Last year, TAB helped win $12.5 million in EPA grant funding through our direct technical assistance, grant writing workshops, and educational forums. So it's important for communities, if you don't know what to do, reach out to us and we can certainly find a way to help you through this process. Next slide. And with that, just like to leave you and say that there are many different buckets of funding available to communities looking to redevelop. The issue that arises is that many communities do not know what they want to do, which makes finding funding an arduous task for some. Fortunately, EPA provides a few grants for governmental entities and nonprofits to conduct planning, assessment, and cleanup, which are the baseline activities for all brownfield projects. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Cindy Nolan from EPA Region 4.
Thanks, Gary. I'm going to present just a little bit of background on the grants that we have available. We've intentionally made this section of the next hour's discussion short because brownfields, we want to impress upon everyone that brownfields is a process and a program which is much bigger than the grants that EPA has to offer. The grants that we have, we consider seed money. We don't fund 100% of what anybody needs to do. EPA is not a federal granting agency. We're a regulatory agency. Most people know us by the other hat that we wear, called enforcement. So as a regulatory agency, all of our money that we hand out in community grants is considered seed money. So I'll just briefly go through some of the grants, but I want to emphasize that what we're doing today is bringing to your attention, whether you receive grant money or not, you can begin that Brownfields program and you can begin those Brownfield processes, the thinking processes, and you can layer those with the opportunities that are going to be discussed after I discuss the grants. So the state's going to talk a little bit about, their program. We have many, many, many brownfield sites that skip grants altogether and go straight into the state program. And then I think we talk a little bit about opportunity zones and how that can be layered on for additional benefits. So we will keep this, the actual grant that are available fairly short. Next slide. All right, so, again, here are the grants that are available. We call them the grants: multi-purpose, assessment, revolving loan, and cleanup. And these are commonly referred to as the MARC grants. The multipurpose is a newer grant. It's a grant that we will be featuring this fall. So this fall we'll have assessment, we will have cleanup, and we will have multipurpose. Last fall we had assessment, we had cleanup, and we had revolving loan fund. So revolving loan fund and multipurpose are bigger pots of money. And I'll explain why as we go into the next slides. As such, because they're bigger pots of money, we rotate each year. So we offer assessment and cleanup every year, but either multipurpose or revolving loan fund grants. Next slide, please. So the multipurpose, this coming fall is going to be the second time that we have offered these multipurpose grants. And they're an $800,000 grant, which for EPA is a tremendous amount of money. They're 5-year grants, and the whole idea is that you get to combine assessment with cleanup. And it's interesting. It was written in such a way that you can assess one site and clean up another site. It doesn't have to be the same site assessment and cleanup. And that's because, as a practical matter, we find that people run into trouble getting a site from assessment to cleanup in a reasonable time frame. Issues come up that need to be resolved. So sometimes they suggest assessing certain sites, and they have a list of sites in these proposals that they may consider cleaning up. So it's a $40,000 cost share. Assessments are, we consider that, no cost share money. That's a pure grant. But the cleanups do have a cost share. So there is a $40,000 cost share just to represent the cleanup portion of the cleanup activities on this grant. Next slide. All right. So the assessment applicant portion of the grants, you've got some options. Community-wide is the most common type of application we see. You can submit multiple sites for your community-wide, and once you receive the grant, you may find additional sites. So it gives you the flexibility. This is a no-cost share grant. That's what's important. This is the assessment grant concept is where you want to do your phase 1s and your phase 2s, where you look at the history of the site, you do some sampling, you might do some site-specific planning, you may set it up for some a cleanup grant application. For large sites, we occasionally see site-specific assessments, and that's because it's got a difficult history, many areas of concern. They know it's going to be an expensive application just to address the one site. So you can apply site-specifically. You can also apply as a coalition, which you heard Jesse talk about. Piedmont Triad had a coalition grant, and that comes with more money, and it comes with an expectation that you will have several partners, and your sites, you have at least 5 dedicated sites that you're going to be addressing. So, it's this is not a one-size-fits-all. We try to anticipate what kinds of options are most common and create a scenario that probably one scenario or another will fit for most applications. Next slide. The cleanup grant, of course, like the assessment grant, is a 3-year grant. And as a result of the Build Act that was passed a couple of years ago, it went from $200,000 per property to $500,000. And it does have a 20% cost share. At the time that you apply for a cleanup grant, you must own the property at the time of application. And that's very important. You also have to do what's called a draft ABCA. And that's, in short, it's an alternatives array for cleanup options that are being considered. And you have to have sought public comment on that array of cleanup options. Next slide, please. The revolving loan fund. This is one of my favorites because of the flexibility involved. But I really like to see it in the hands of larger geographic areas like states who are planning councils or councils of government like Piedmont Triad, because then they have the flexibility to work in a broad geographic area. And we give the loan to the applicant. The applicant then turns around and makes loans to subgrantees. And this is $1 million grant. And again, it's not going to pay for everything in terms of a cleanup, but it may get you the pieces of the puzzle that you can then layer together with other tax and other financial opportunities or instruments and make a cleanup happen. And then revolved money goes back to the grantee, who could then reloan it to another organization for yet additional cleanup loans. Some portion of this can be a grant, which means you don't have to pay it back, but some portion must be a loan. And these can be super low interest, 0.5%, 1%, things that make it the cheapest money you'll find anywhere. So, but because it's a high amount, $1 million, again, we don't fund very many of them across the nation, usually about 8 to 10. And we rotate it again with the multi-purpose grant. Next slide, please. Okay, those are the core grant programs. And if you've made your way onto this email list and you're attending, then you will become aware in the future of when we do more in-depth training about how to actually apply for those grants. That's something that NJIT will be hosting. We also do a national training webinar that EPA in our Washington office hosts every year. And of course, the regional office staff, my staff, are available to talk with you at any time as well. But I also want to make you aware that we also have a job training program. I love this program. It's extremely popular. Again, that's we issue those solicitations annually. The next one will be coming out at the end of summer. I'm going to say somewhere around the August timeframe. We keep it a little off cycle from our primary grant program, so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. But that's another very useful program, so that we're employing people in an area on the cleanups in that area. That's kind of the overall goal. But we also train folks in, wastewater treatment, plant operations or drinking water, plant operations, lead abatement contractors, and all sorts of environmental fields, not just brownfields remediation. And then, we also have in-house in our office, we keep a small a small contract for what we call targeted brownfields assessments. So you can contact us directly to help support a phase 1 or phase 2 on a particular site. And if we have the funds available, then we would be happy to assist in that solo project. And we tend to look toward our unsuccessful applicants and offer them that TBA opportunity in order to sort of kickstart them in that Brownfields program, but it's open to anyone. Next slide, please. All right, so it just in summary, the grant program itself is pretty competitive. In this region, only about 1 in 5 applications are successful. We receive more applications than any other region. Last year, it was 109. And it was almost that same number in preceding several years. So to put together a very competitive application, and they're always offered in the fall, they're open for 60 days. So it usually opens somewhere around October, and it usually closes somewhere in December, although that can vary. You really have to begin that planning now. You need to talk about putting that team together. If you could go to the next slide, please. I'm going to reinforce some of the points that Gary was emphasizing. Plan to succeed, but plan early. If you get the grant, great. And if you don't, there are still many other tools to help you put this redevelopment program into place. But right now, you should be thinking about, is there a Brownfields champion who's going to dog everybody that needs to be involved in this? Do you have a support team that is diverse? Is there political support? Do you know where you want to go in your area? Is there a target? Is there a particular target area, target facility? Have you engaged the community yet? Have you done any planning around this? In short, do you know where you're going, and do you know how you're going to get there? The most successful proposals have very clear and succinct answers to all of these. And the more planning up front you do, the more that will come through in the writing of the proposal, and the greater chance it has of success. So I'm going to leave it there, and let's talk about the, let's move on to the state and talk about some of the other really great opportunities, whether you receive a grant or not.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Cindy.
Yep.
Next slide, please. Next, we're going to have Haley Eirick and Jordan Thompson from NCD to talk about their Brownfield program.
Thanks, Gary. My name is Haley Eirick. I will be presenting today with my coworker, Jordan Thompson. We are both Brownfield project managers in the state. The way the state works, we sort of split up east and west. We're a long state. I work more in the east, Jordan is more in the west. And we are both EPA liaisons as well. And we will get into what that means a little bit later. Next slide.
Thanks, Haley. So we also get asked on a regular basis, what is a brownfields property? So we do retain the standard EPA definition, but we also add a little bit to that, in that in order to be a North Carolina brownfields, it needs to be an abandoned, idled, or underused property. So a property that's not being put to its highest and best use. So the North Carolina program is voluntary. A prospective developer has to apply into our program. And when they apply, they have to demonstrate that the property is abandoned, idled, underutilized, it has real or perceived contamination, and that is in some way hindering the redevelopment of the property. And in addition to that, this prospective developer has to show that they are not a responsible party for those impacts that are real or perceived to be on the property. So we don't deal with prospective developers and grant them liability protection, which is a key component to our program, which we'll touch on a little later on. But what the goal is of the North Carolina Brownfields program is to make a site safe for the intended reuse through land recycling. We're not necessarily a remediation program, but a mitigation program. So if you have soil, groundwater impacts, we have to mitigate such that through land use restrictions, we are not creating an avenue for access to those contaminants on a property, and that it's safe for whatever you want to do with it. A park, apartment complex, commercial reuse. We also want to look at what public benefit that project is bringing to the community. Are we increasing jobs? Are we increasing the local tax base? Are we adding green space or parks to where there used to be an abandoned textile mill, such as Jesse touched on with the Mayodan site? And what we're also doing is competing with urban sprawl. So can we save any green fields and reuse these properties? So that's what the North Carolina Brownfields program is in a nutshell. And we'll get into the mechanisms that we use in just a little bit. Next slide.
So to break down sort of the difference between the federal and the state brownfields programs, you heard Cindy talk about EPA's brownfields program, but we do want to mention as well that they provide funding directly to our North Carolina program as well. And what that does is it allows us to do things just like this. We try to do outreach, attend conferences with EPA, learn about the grants, work with your communities to try to get you some grant money and whatnot. So then looking at the state role, what we do is we work with our prospective developers or communities, municipalities to work towards a brownfield agreement. We'll talk about what a brownfield agreement is a little bit later. So the state level, we're really providing that guidance for your site and how to redevelop it in a safe manner. And part of that is through, the deed recordation of land use restrictions that would run with the land in perpetuity. A big part here is also the tax incentive and liability protection to the prospective developer. So that tax incentive is a local property tax exclusion on improvements made to the property over the course of 5 years. And that can be sort of re-upped if there's future redevelopment in addition. So this is a great marketing tool for your communities to use to try to draw in some of that private investment money while you can still sort of maintain some municipal control about the site redevelopment itself through the Brownfield agreement and the land use. So kind of a takeaway here is that we're two separate programs, federal and state. with a separate eligibility process for both. EPA has a preference that sites come through the state program. It's kind of a good handoff to make sure that site is in a program in perpetuity and that it's safe. But I will say you do not need to have EPA money to come through the state program either. But if you do have it, that EPA money can pay for our fees as well. Next slide.
All right, so what do these Brownfields agreements cover? So the culmination of any assessment, and once you apply into the program, do assessment work on the property, we will issue a Brownfields agreement, which is a legal binding document for the prospective developer and all future landowners on the property. And so that prospective developer, as we said, cannot be a responsible party for the known contamination on the property. And any future owners, if it turns out that someone purchases the property who previously contaminated the property, we would still be able to look to them for assessment. So what that means is the Brownfields agreement does not affect any state agency other than Brownfields to enforce against a responsible party. If the site is a former dry cleaner, is a former gas station, a former textile mill, and there is an entity that is still viable that was responsible for those impacts, the prospective developer's responsibility is to allow those other state agencies to come onto the property to assess. So again, we are requiring mitigation less so than cleanup. So it's very possible that ongoing contamination that has to be assessed by a responsible party or another DEQ agency will be going on into perpetuity. So the prospective developer has to make the site safe for the reuse. Some of that may be groundwater monitoring, vapor mitigation monitoring. But as far as assessing the contaminants and what those groundwater plumes are doing over time, that falls to a responsible party in those cases. So these Brownfields agreements provide a covenant not to sue between the state and the prospective developer and future landowners. If you caused or contributed to impacts, it's not for you. And the prospective developer and all future landowners have to follow our land use restrictions. So as a trade-off to not requiring remediation, the mitigation comes in the form of land use restrictions. You can't use groundwater on the property. You can't dig up soil that's known to be contaminated without telling DEQ first, and it has to be handled very carefully. If there is vapor intrusion concerns on the property, you have to install mitigation systems for those and have to make sure that they are working really forever as long as that building is present. So a key thing for this for municipalities is this Brownfields agreement can be completed in anticipation of future redevelopment for a property. So if a landowner has a property and a municipality has EPA assessment money, then that landowner can work with EPA to get the property assessed, get a Brownfields agreement in place, and the land use definitions on the property is going to be what the property is approved for reuse for. So if it's zoned for commercial reuse or a park or residential or whatever that is, the land use definitions add an extra layer of protection to that say that these are the approved reuses through the North Carolina Brownfields program that the property can be reused for. And any redevelopment has to be approved by the DEC Brownfields program through an environmental management plan, which is a little more in the weeds than we're going to get here today. But any change to those land use definitions, say the property is approved for residential in the Brownfields agreement, and a commercial redeveloper wants to come in and put in a shopping complex, then the Brownfields agreement wouldn't necessarily allow that without an amendment. So this is another great tool for municipalities to have control over where a property is going to go as far as the reuse of it. And again, it's great for marketing to those third-party developers that a Brownfields agreement is in place. It has liability protections that pertain to that property. And it also, allows for tax incentives as well that I believe Haley is going to touch on. So as of January 1st of this year, we have 548 of these recorded agreements across the state. And in addition to that, we have multiple that have been recorded since January 1st, and we are working on quite a few additional agreements where a Brownfields agreement with its liability protections will eventually be recorded with the Register of Deeds office. Next slide. Into
a bit more detail about a Brownfield agreement, which is sort of the final product, if you will, of going through the North Carolina Brownfields program. It is a legal document signed by both parties, ourselves being the state, as well as the prospective developer or the municipality. And it's recorded with the deed. It runs with the land in perpetuity. So a couple of these components, a work to be performed section. So this is everything that would be required at the site to make it safe for its intended reuse. A lot of this could be done, before a brownfield agreement is actually written. And that could include things like environmental assessment, limited remediation. Like Jordan mentioned, we are a risk-based program. So what that means is we take the contamination at the site as well as the intended reuse into account to calculate what that risk is for future users, and do things really need to be cleaned up, or can certain materials be left in place if there's no exposure. So that work to be performed section can include environmental assessment, remediation if needed, mitigation, sort of things like if soil needs to be removed, if you need a vapor intrusion mitigation system, stuff like that. And you can use your EPA funds for this work that needs to be done, depending on what sort of grant you have, if you have one. The next section is the land use restrictions, which Jordan touched on a bit. These are essentially, they tell you what you can and can't do at the property and give you guidelines for your safe redevelopment. These are determined based on the site-specific risk assessment that we do. And they would apply, again, this is recorded with the deed, so it would apply to all future owners. There's an annual certification that we do to make sure that all of these land use restrictions are being complied with every year, and that nothing has changed, and that the property is still safe. Jordan also mentioned the municipal control that you can use here of what specific land uses you'd like to see at this property. That's a great tool. Next is the liability protection section. We talked about that a bit and sort of what that covers, what that doesn't. It is not federal or third party protection. This would be just from the state. They wouldn't be able to sort of go after the developer at that point. If you're a responsible party, you can still be on the hook, but if you're a responsible party, you're not going to be eligible for our program. And then the last sort of section here is under our statute, we have sort of reopener clause. And what this allows for is the continued protection of public health and the environment in case you've got new information at the site, new contamination, violations of the Brownfield Agreement. The Brownfield Agreement is a legal document, so if it's violated by either party, we can go in and reopen and kind of do what we need to do to make things right. Something else that might be sort of under this category is if we have new science that comes about. In recent years, we've had some new information regarding specific contaminants or contaminant migration. Vapor intrusion is one of those sort of ever-changing scientific areas where we might need to go back and look at some of our older Brownfield agreements where we didn't know as much about vapor intrusion or a new type of contaminant. So that's sort of a quick overview of a Brownfields agreement. Next slide.
All right, so we are running short on time, so I'll be very quick here. This is just one example site that used EPA funds to come through the North Carolina Brownfields program. This is the Shops on Ennis site in Salisbury. You'll see the Brownfields project number top left. And the next slide will have a example or a link that takes you to all of our project files if you're really curious. So this was a former restaurant, automotive service center, and nightclub at various times, and it sits in a very prominent area of Salisbury, and it was just a dilapidated vacant structure that a prospective developer had come in, and they wanted to go through the North Carolina Brownfields program. They wanted to turn it into a multi-tenant commercial building, retail building. And Salisbury used their EPA assessment funds to do phase 1 and phase 2 work through the North Carolina Brownfields program. And they ended up with a completed Brownfields agreement that outlines vapor intrusion mitigation that has to be done on the property. There is a vapor mitigation system beneath this building, and it also outlines what the property can be used for in the future. So this is just one example site where EPA funds have been used on the North Carolina program, and there is a great in-use development, and it's a much higher and better use of this property with the new buildings and the multiple tenants in place. Next slide.
Okay. Thank you so much, Haley, for sharing that information from DEQ. Again, I want to apologize to everybody. We are running a bit over time. We have two more presenters who have some good information. Just please stay on the line and listen to the things that they're going to be sharing with you. The other thing is, again, the presentations are available after the seminar, or after the webinar. So please look out in your emails for a link to all the presentation materials and resources. So next, we will have David Putnam talk about opportunity zones. David.
Hi, thank you. My name is David Putnam. I work at the Piedmont Triad Regional Council as a community and strategic initiatives planner. I will make this very brief and be as respectful of everyone's time as possible. As you can see on the first slide, we have a lot of opportunity zones in the Piedmont Triad Regional Council's member region, 43 to be exact, and I'm here to tell you about how they kind of synchronize with the Brownfields program. Next slide. So I have to start by quickly sharing that we are neither lawyers nor are we accountants. Next slide. There are 43 qualified opportunity zones in the Piedmont Triad region. They are set in stone and they are like that across the nation. So if you're in a different region or a different state, please check the census tracts that the QOZs are tied to, and you'll be able to confirm that. The goal is to encourage long-term investments in communities, and they run on 3 core principles, which are deferral, reduction, and exclusion. Next slide. Qualified Opportunity Zone Fund is the tool that is used to drive the Opportunity Zone investment. They must self-certify with the IRS, and they can be either a corporation or a partnership. They have to make 90% of their investment within an asset of the Opportunity Zone, but they can be spread across multiple Opportunity Zones. They come in many different shapes and sizes. Some are very large, some are very small. And next slide. You can make 3 different types of investments: stock, interest, and tangible property. Qualified Opportunity Zones expire on 2028, and then the sale of the QOZ investment type for the investors that are on the line, those need to be sold by 2047. Next slide. We are going to skip over this. Next slide. So really briefly, brownfields and opportunity zones, as akin to other federal programs, are very much, I guess you could call it, being collaborated on. So there's a lot of incentives that stack with each other. When you get a copy of this PowerPoint, you will be able to click on the interactive links that I've provided you. And IRS regulations is one of them, particularly as it relates to brownfields and opportunity zones. But really briefly, I want to go through kind of the 3 bullet points to hit this, and there's also the table that I've provided below. So number 1, a qualified opportunity fund investment in a brownfield or in a property that was involuntarily transferred to local government can satisfy the IRS requirement for commencing an original use. That is very, very helpful. Next slide. The second point is expenses for site assessment and remediation qualify as eligible costs that demonstrate substantial improvement at a qualified opportunity zone property if they're improved within a 30-month period. And the third bullet point is permitting delays caused by the government that would otherwise cause the QOF to fail the IRS requirement to deploy capital within 31 months will be tolled or delayed. Now, my slides are a little bit different from this, so I'll go and continue with some added information. The EPA considers opportunity zones very heavily. So for brownfield cleanup assessment and RLF applicants, they cannot receive full points unless the intended project or projects are located within a qualified opportunity zone. And to put it in perspective, approximately 75% of fiscal year 2019 grant awards were in and adjacent to qualified opportunity zones. Next slide. Okay. So one of the poster children for opportunity zones and kind of brownfield work right now that we have within our region is the city of High Point, and specifically the Southwest High Point Opportunity Zone Tract. As you can see, I've got some quick metric information up there at the top of the left-hand side, but also I wanted to provide people with some community development information as to relate to, you know, your discussions with your local investors and developers. Next slide. And I have some pictures that will be provided to you all later, but for now, we'll pass it on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And next up, we'll have Brad from Groundworks go over a case study example of Scarrito Park. So Brad, you can take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brad Busher. I'm a project director with Groundwork Lawrence. We're part of Groundwork USA. Next slide. Groundwork USA is a network of trusts. We have 23 trusts across the country. We were started by the through a partnership with the EPA and the National Park Service. Next slide. Here in Lawrence, we're really focused on the physical environment. We're focused on partnerships to create different types of programs. We really focus on empowering the people and delivering programs designed by those people. Next slide. And these are sort of our 4 program areas, the result of the people driving our program areas. So community, open space, environmental projects, education, job training, and a pretty significant fresh food and healthy living program. Next slide, please. This is an aerial photograph of Lawrence, just to give you a sense of what the town's like. It's an old mill town developed as an industrially planned community in the mid-1800s. Essentially, a company built a dam to deliver water to the mills, and boom, you had a lot of industrial activity happening here. Next slide. Lawrence is an environmental justice community. We are 74% Latino, 38% foreign-born. We have a huge population under the age of 18, and a median household income of just $32,800, which is really significant compared to Massachusetts, where the average median income is north of $60,000. Next slide. So Groundwork, this is an aerial of the Spigot that shows the Spigot River. You can see these circles. The Scarrito Park, it focuses on that red circle at a bend in the river. But I just wanted to highlight the 6 other parks that we have created. These are all Brownfield Park projects, but Scarrito was the first. Next slide. So Brownfields is catalysts. This is an example of what happens when you start planning, and you can use maps to illustrate why a park or a brownfield should become a park versus another use. So on the map on the left is open space per capita, and you can see where it's red. That's where you have less open space than where it's green, for example. And on the right-hand side, we mapped the population density of youth under the age of 18. And so combine these two, you can see the demand for a park space is high within this neighborhood. Next slide. So the Scarrito Park context, it's a fairly large site for Lawrence, 2.7 acres. It's hidden between large houses, which we call triple deckers, 3 stories, and with 1 unit on each story. So there's a street wall that hides the site. But it's also next to the river. as well. And next slide, please. So this slide shows how the site's history was developed. You had these mills next to the river, and you can see the blue dotted line shows where the developer took water from the river to power the mills. By 1956, that raceway, the water source was gone, and the mill site had become home for 2 different laundries. And meanwhile, you had this street wall of all this high density housing infilling between the street and the mill. Next slide. But on the back end of this site, you really have a beautiful river, a bend in the river. There's a significant drop in the gradient of the river. It's a scenic site, but people didn't know about it unless you lived right next to it. Next slide. So the history of this site dates back to the 1800s, but by the 1980s, the site had been all the buildings had been demolished. It was largely impervious surface, and lots of back taxes owed. And by 2000, the community is starting to organize. We're starting to do some planning around this site. Excuse me, in partnership with the local CDC. Next slide. So how do you start to generate interest? The first strategy is community engagement. And we did this by holding a cleanup. Nobody else was doing a river cleanup. So we engaged the community. You see that guy's t-shirt, that's the same brand that's been present for over 20 years. You walk around town and you see people wearing these t-shirts. And so you start to get people closer to the river, closer to the open spaces along the river, and hopefully change their negative perception about the resource. Next slide. You do neighborhood planning. You convene residents to talk about what could happen at that site. So and hopefully you come up with a concept plan that incorporates everybody's input. And this meetings are happening in our offices, but they're also happening at the site in alleyways and at kitchen tables of residents. Next slide. So then you develop a concept. The meeting, this is great. Everybody's coalescing around a concept and a general idea. It gives you a pretty graphic to start to promote the project. Next slide. Again, more visuals just to illustrate that to decision makers and residents and funders that this is a valid concept. Next slide. So, quick history of how long it took to actually go from planning to park. In 2003, there's a settlement about back taxes. In 2004, Bank of America actually acquires the site through a corporate merger. Fast forward, next slide. Start doing fundraising in 2005, and by 2006, the state and Bank of America signed the covenant not to sue, releasing the owner of future liabilities associated with the contamination at the site. City Council votes to accept the land, and in 2006, we have the ribbon cutting. Next slide. Great. This is what the park looks like today. It's a very cool space, and I mean that temperature-wise, lots of trees. It's kind of like a glade in the forest. Next slide. Here's some of the young children enjoying that play space. There's also a basketball court, which is super popular with the older 12 to 18-year-old set. Next slide. We're layering our programming in the space. We're creating spaces for people to grow food at community gardens. We have a large community garden network. Next slide. So just to summarize the lessons learned from this project, the first of our Brownfield to Park projects, the first that led to 6 other Brownfield projects, actually 8 others. Challenges, you got to overcome these challenges, this negative perception that it's a brownfield, it's a vacant lot, we don't have the capacity, we're never going to get the resources. And you got to turn those into opportunities. You got to develop neighborhood leadership. You got to embrace nonprofit capacity. You got to have solid partners when you're doing these proposals to EPA and the state to bring resources to your project. Start mapping and doing planning, because planning, that process leads to relationship building. It starts to change the narrative and it results in improved public health. Next slide. So this is groundwork. This is what we do. In addition to changing places and changing lives, we really believe that it's about changing systems. And I think that previous slide illustrated what we mean by that. And next slide. And that's me. So if you're interested in learning more about our Brownfield to Park process, feel free to email me or call me. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. Again, I just want to thank everybody for attending the webinar and bearing with us. Just wanted to remind you guys that if anybody on the other side or anybody attending the webinar needs help or needs any assistance in regards to redeveloping their brownfields, or you just don't even know where to start, please reach out to us. We have our email there listed at tab@njit.edu. We have our hotline. And following us on Twitter and all social media outlets are the only communities that do not receive TAB assistance are the ones that do not ask. So please, it's a really informal process, and it's free to all eligible entities. Next slide. And here's all our contact information. So if you need to reach out to anybody who spoke today, just please, again, take down this information. And thank you to all the panelists as well for attending and providing a wealth of knowledge to the attendees. And with that, I would like to conclude the Brownfield 101 webinar. Take care, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.